stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now, huh?
Thanks, Jerry, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1426th edition of Motorsports Unlimited, titled Explanation 18. Today we continue our explanation of what Motorsports Unlimited has been all about for the past 30 plus years. As explained many times, our interest is the survival of motorsport and all of the attendant things that activity provides. We will continue that discussion on this episode, but it's a little difficult to introduce because we will be picking up on what we started on in the last episode, Explanation 17. Hopefully you will recall I was in the middle of explaining Turbonique engines, while at the same time mentioning it was not my intention to provide a detailed explanation of Turbonique. But there was a reason why I was telling part of the Turbonique story, and I intend to get to it. Once you understand what Turbonique was and how it happens to be a story of which I am familiar. If I remember correctly, and you know I do, when we ran out of time on Explanation 17, I was in the middle of explaining what happens when one pushes the button to fire a Turbonique engine. Let's pick up the story about a minute or so before we ran out of time on the last show. I know, splitting up the story like this makes it more difficult to follow, but there's no other way and still provide all the information. I'm hoping the serious folks who have some real interest in this will first watch Explanation 17, then follow it with this episode, Explanation 18. Gee, I hope that's clear. Now, let's continue with my explanation of how the brilliant Gene Middlebrooks designed Turbonique engines worked. In Explanation 17, I've just finished explaining an overview of the sequence of events that a Turbonique motor needs to run, and it's all kicked off by pushing a button. What actually happens when he pushes the button? The button to which I refer is just an electric contact that energizes the oxygen solenoid, allowing pressurized oxygen to be injected into the combustion chamber. Of course, oxygen doesn't burn. It aids combustion, but by itself, it does nothing. In the case of the Turbonique engine, it floods the combustion chamber with pure oxygen. And there is a sensor on the downstream side of the oxygen system that tells the next electrical switch to close and energizes the fuel solenoid. When the fuel solenoid opens, it injects raw fuel under pressure into the combustion chamber, which by now is filled with pure oxygen, where it is ignited by the ignition system. This creates the explosion, as I've referred to the rapid burning of fuel in the combustion chamber. Okay, we now have an explosion in the combustion chamber. What does that give us? Pressure. The same thing we get in the cylinder of a small block Chevy engine when we put in fuel and air and compress it and ignite it. Pressure that we can put to work. Now, you might be thinking, there must be more to it than that. And there is. Just like in the mythical small block Chevy engine to which I keep referring, one boom doesn't do you much good. So how do we get more than one boom? I mentioned during the process of getting ready to operate a Turbonique engine, one must set it up. This means to check the ignition, set the fuel and oxygen pressures. Turbonique engines are designed to operate at 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure. When setting up the Turbonique engine to run, one must check the ignition system to make sure the tractor coils are producing sparks. Some Turbonique motors use one spark plug, some use two. In the case of the 1,000 horsepower engine, it uses two spark plugs. When the ignition system is activated, the spark plug or plugs are buzzing constantly. Then you need to set the oxygen pressure. Since the engine is designed to run at 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure, one would typically set the oxygen to something below that, perhaps 280 pounds. The idea is oxygen is only used to aid combustion during starting. Once the engine is running, the 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure will shut off the incoming oxygen. In other words, the oxygen is only used to help start the engine. It isn't needed to run the engine. Similarly, When one does the setup, he makes sure the fuel pressure is set to 300 pounds. So when fuel is being sprayed into the combustion chamber and burning, the combustion chamber pressure will try to exceed 300 pounds. When it does, the pressure in the combustion chamber will shut off fuel because the combustion chamber pressure is higher than the incoming fuel pressure. This is a continuous process as the engine runs. Oh yeah, this is how you get more than one boom. Every time the fuel in the combustion chamber lights, you get a boom. Just like the small block Chevy gets a boom every time you ignite a charge in a cylinder, except with a rocket motor, the boom could be 20 or 30 times a second. Liquid fuel rocket motors are called impulse power, meaning fuel flows until there is 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure, and that shuts it off almost immediately. The pressure in the combustion chamber quickly relaxes and fuel flows again because the pressure in the combustion chamber drops to lower than the incoming fuel pressure, allowing fuel to flow again. Think of the interior of the combustion chamber something like a fireball in a cave that is constantly growing and receding. This is why rocket motors make a roaring sound when they run. The constant rising and falling pressure in the combustion chamber as the fireball continuously lights and relights. While in theory the fireball never really goes out, the constant changes in pressure as it tries to achieve and maintain 300 pounds of pressure creates the familiar sound. If you are able to photograph the exhaust signature in the right light, you can see it shows a series of impulses. That is how the engine maintains a pretty constant 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure while running. By the way, the motor doesn't really care where the pressure comes from or why. It just wants 300 pounds. You could modify a gas station compressor if you wanted to risk your life and get it to pump up 300 pounds of pressure. The problem isn't getting 300 pounds. It's maintaining 300 pounds with a 6-inch diameter hole in the side. That's right. One has to achieve and maintain 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure while losing most of its pressure out of a 6-inch hole. Why a 6-inch hole? Yeah, because that's the number I'm using to illustrate the loss of pressure that makes the engine do work. It could be the opening that guides the created pressure through ports and forces the turbine wheel to spin. It could also be a nozzle, as one might have one or more on a thrust engine. The point is, you need to make 300 pounds of pressure while losing a great deal of pressure every second. All the Turbonique motors run the same way as I've just described, and they all ran well. So, what happened to them? As soon as I got back to Chicago with my new 1,000 horsepower Turbonique motor, I took a guess and ordered a rear wheel and tire. A guess because I had no idea how wide or tall the tire should be. When one builds something like this, there is a lot of guesswork that'll probably have to be redone, but one has to start somewhere. As I think you can see in the picture, I was a happy camper. This was the beginning of my Turbonique powered drag bike. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you value things, I had discovered flat track motorcycle racing. I loved it and felt the Turbonique project could be backburnered for a while. Flat track motorcycle racing is a young man's sport, and I was already too old. Most top flat track racers were retiring by the time they were 30, and I was just about to turn 30. I could see I didn't have much time left to enjoy this sport, and any kind of motorsport takes your full attention, not to mention all of your resources. Oh yes, another complication. A few weeks after I returned from Florida with my brand new Turbonique 1,000 horsepower shaft output motor and newly purchased aluminum rear wheel and M&H slick in anticipation of laying out a chassis, word reached me that Gene Middlebrooks had been arrested and jailed for mail fraud. You know, it's really interesting how differently people react to things. Most of my friends were busting my chops over it. You know, I spent a lot of money on something that was a fraud. I didn't see it that way at all. I thought I was incredibly lucky to get one of these motors before Turbonique was closed down by the government. I really had no concern about it being a fraud because I saw one run. Turbonique was not a fraud. I knew what I saw, and Turbonique was the real deal. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I'd find out eventually. For right now, I had to concentrate on flat track racing because, before it was too late, because I was concerned about my aging. My Turbonique drag bike would have to wait. In fact, that was one of the advantages I saw in drag racing. One didn't have to be a child to be competitive. There were many successful drag racers in their 50s, and when you're 30, that was a long way off. My flat track racing career was both a big success and a miserable failure. A success in the terms of pleasure received and achievements realized. Of course, my expectations were relatively low. I knew I was too old and, oh yes, something else, I was too big. One couldn't stand in the riders' lineup during the crowd introductions without realizing almost everyone in the line was at least 10 years younger than me and much smaller. During these introduction ceremonies, it would be impossible not to notice how much smaller these guys were than me. I mean, seriously, I'm not that big. At 5'10" and about 170 pounds, I was of average size and weight by any standard. I remember one night looking down the line of riders being introduced and noticing how small their feet were. I couldn't help but think I was racing children. I amused myself by pondering how they didn't fall either forward or back. They didn't seem to have feet large enough to provide a platform for their body. Anyway, I enjoyed flat track motorcycle racing thoroughly. I knew I was too old, learned I was too big and heavy, but all things considered, I did well. Certainly, I was no threat to national caliber riders, but I was as good or better than any local competitor, regardless of age or size, and had the trophies and awards to prove it. Sadly, the years went by too quickly, and soon I was troubled by my decreasing performance. I really didn't get it. I felt fine. In fact, I felt I was stronger than I ever had been. I had no explanation for my decreasing success. It seemed like the first 2 or 3 years I was getting faster and faster. This made sense. I was learning and growing, not to mention developing technical tricks to my advantage. Now, regardless of what I tried, I was no longer improving. Worse, I kept records and knew what kind of lap times of which I should have been capable. I knew it wasn't the other guys getting faster. I was getting slower, and I knew it. But I had no explanation for it. I felt fine, my machinery was better than ever, yet I was slower. In 1975, I was involved in a major accident during the junior main event at the Beaver Dam, Wisconsin half mile. I don't remember anything about it other than laying on the racetrack with broken riders and twisted machines all around me. The ambulance crew was trying to do something to me. Later, I was told that they were putting an air splint on my leg. I passed out from the pain. I awoke in the Beaver Dam Hospital as doctors were discussing the possibilities of removing my right leg. I objected. They were angry. The next thing I remember was laying down in my van between motorcycles. I was going kind of in and out of consciousness. I could tell we were moving. Both motorcycles were in the van, my XR750 and my buddy's Todd's Trackmaster Triumph. Both machines hovering over me like racehorses in their stable. They were strapped down, of course, but I could see them moving around. They were ready. I wasn't. Time passed. Then the back doors of the van opened. More medical professionals hovering over me. One, who seemed to be in charge, was plenty pissed and wanted to know who had allowed a patient to be transported like this. My friend Todd told me later I had dirt and oil dripping on me from the bikes, and the doctor flipped out when he saw it. We were at Elmhurst Orthopedic Hospital in Illinois. My right leg was badly broken, a compound fracture of the tibia and fibula. The guys who came to see me in the hospital told me they thought for sure I would lose the leg. They were on the track when I was laying there and said below my right knee, all of the bones were sticking out, and the lower part of my right leg was completely broken off, held on only by the skin, and pointed off at a right angle to the rest of my leg. The Elmhurst doctors felt they could save the leg and operated. A year later, it hadn't healed, and they operated again, performing a bone graft. 6 months later, the cast was removed, and I began rehab. Of course, with all of this, I spent a lot of time in the hospital. Time to think. I had a feeling my flat track motorcycle racing days might be over, although I hoped I could get 1 or 2 more seasons in. While in the hospital, watching television one day, they broadcast a rocket launch from Cape Kennedy. I was reminded of my 1,000 horsepower, 135-pound Turbonique shaft output motor. Oh yes, my drag bike project. Over time, I'd thought about it a number of times. Every time I saw a magazine with a new top fuel drag bike competing, I thought about motorcycle drag racing again. And for some reason, I ran the numbers through my mind over and over. Beating other bikes was not my interest. I kept thinking about beating top fuel dragsters with a bike. But as much as I liked what I was seeing, I didn't think they could get the job done. Most recently, I'd seen Russ Collins' new Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, a beautiful triple-engine Honda featuring 3 4-cylinder fuel-injected overhead cam Honda engines, beautifully crafted, a real showpiece. As always, I ran the numbers in my head, and as much as I liked the bike, admired the workmanship, applauded the originality, the numbers just weren't there. Too heavy and not enough power. Those of us who seek to take on the top fuel car guys, and I'm not suggesting that's what Russ Collins was doing, but I am, have to respect how good the top fuel car guys are at what they do. At the very least, we have to have a superior power to weight ratio. I've calculated every possible way to do it with a bike with a piston engine power. I could come up with no combination of engines that would deliver the very least a favorable power to weight ratio. Looking at the beautiful Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, one can easily see there is a possibility of more power. Supercharging, another engine. The problem is they all add weight, meaning more power is needed. I tried endless combination of motorcycle engines, automobile engines, aircraft engines, perhaps most promising snowmobile engines. Still, I just couldn't come up with a favorable power to weight ratio. Yes, I could add more power, but it always added weight, meaning I needed still more power. And let's not forget, top fuel cars put the power through 2 rear tires, yielding superior traction, particularly as you add weight. Seeing the space launch on TV reminded me I had a secret weapon. It's funny, really. I spent a lot of time worrying that someone else would do it before me, a Turbonique-powered drag bike. I guess I got a few breaks along the way. First of all, the largest, most prestigious drag racing organization, the NHRA, banned rockets. Not just rocket motorcycles, but rockets, period. I remember this period, even though it was a long time ago. I just don't know if I remember the exact details correctly. It was about 50 years ago, but it seemed to me we had about 4 rocket cars running at local drag strips around the country, and between those 4 cars, they killed 3 drivers. I personally remember seeing the pollution packer run at Great Lakes Dragway, the Grove, in Union Grove, Wisconsin. It was awesome. The car accelerated so hard, one could see little wisps of smoke coming off of all 4 tires. That's right, smoke coming off the tires. No, they weren't spinning. They couldn't keep up with the fierce acceleration of the vehicle. As I said, it was awesome. The only thing missing was noise. The pollution packer was a peroxide rocket, meaning a chemical reaction rocket, not a combustion rocket. Still, it was awesome, and I haven't forgotten it after all these years. I should also mention, they didn't ban the rockets because there was anything dangerous about the rocket motors. It was the speed of which they were capable. I remember the details of an accident in Florida that killed the driver. It seems to me he was a Chicagoite. I just don't remember. I'm just not sure. Anyway, it seems he made a pass of over 400 miles an hour. This was before 300-mile-an-hour passes were even possible. The track had a cyclone fence separating the track from the ticket holders. As is common, the track had tarpaulins on the cyclone fence to ensure people had to buy a ticket to watch. As the rocket car went past the finish line and past the tarped fence, it was caught by a crosswind at over 400 miles an hour. The car tumbled many times, killing the driver. The rocket cars were banned because they were capable of speeds never before seen at a drag strip. While I don't agree with banning them, there is no question increases in speed should come in small increments. Can you imagine a Model T Ford capable of 200 miles an hour and guaranteed disaster? There is much to learn between 50 miles an hour and 200 miles an hour. Many lessons to be learned. Oh yeah, at about the same time, the NHRA banned Turbonique-powered vehicles. They were getting a reputation for blowing up somewhat randomly and killing people. Let me take a moment to expand on that. You know, the notion that Turbonique motors were dangerous. Of course they were. They were and are liquid fuel rocket motors. Few would argue that liquid fuel rocket motors are safe to operate. Even professionals in the field of rocketry acknowledge that liquid fuel rockets are among the most dangerous. This is because of the amount of energy being released quickly. It doesn't take a genius to figure out if a motor develops 1,000 horsepower, it uses a lot of fuel rapidly. All the power any engine makes comes from the fuel. Fuel is the only element in a power plant that has BTUs. So, if it makes a ton of power, it uses a ton of fuel. And that means it has the hardware to deliver a ton of fuel. And that's where the danger begins. The real danger of liquid fuel rocket engines is what is referred to as a momentary failure to fire. What this means is, if the motor fails to light when the first atomized droplets of fuel enter the combustion chamber, fuel is accumulating. Then if it lights, you don't have just atomized droplets of fuel in the combustion chamber, you have accumulated liquid fuel. Now the engine is a bomb, not an engine. It is very important that the very first atomized droplets of fuel entering the combustion chamber light, and light immediately. I actually have an interesting story about this. When I was building my Turbonique drag bike, Chuck Bush, a racing friend of mine, dropped by my shop. When he saw what I was doing, the first words out of his mouth were, "I ain't riding it." "Well, I don't want you to ride it, Chuck. I want to ride it." "That's because you don't know nothing about those Turbonique engines." Chuck was one of the guys I raced flat track motorcycles with. He was a good local rider, but a little on the wild side. He wasn't exactly a technical guy, so I was surprised he knew what a Turbonique motor was. Of course, I asked. Yeah, a couple of years ago, one of my neighbors bought a Turbonique go-kart. After he got it together, he was looking for someone to try driving it. Everyone told him to call Chuck, he'll ride anything. I could believe this. Chuck had that kind of reputation and had the scars to show for it. I asked him what happened. Chuck explained. They told me to just sit in it, and when I was ready, step on the gas pedal, which was just an electrical switch. So that's what I did. And nothing happened. So I hit the pedal again. Nothing happened. So I hit the pedal again. As he was talking, my heart sank. I knew enough about Turbonique motors to know if you push the button and nothing happens, get the hell away from it, because every time you hit the button, you are spraying high-pressure fuel into the combustion chamber. A combustion chamber full of pure oxygen with fuel in it and spark plugs sparking. So what finally happened, I asked, wondering why he wasn't dead. The third time I hit the gas pedal, it started to move, kind of slowly. Then, all of a sudden, it hauled ass like I'd been kicked in the back by a mule. I had all I could do to get hold of the steering wheel. By the time I caught my breath and managed to get off the gas pedal and hit the brakes, I must have been doing 100 miles an hour on a small city side street. It was amazing. When I got it slowed down, I looked back and the entire street was on fire. Seriously, on fire. And I knew the cops would be coming. Chuck, you're lucky you're not dead. Hell, I know that. That's why I'm not riding yours. He didn't hang around long enough for the cops to come, so he never knew what happened, but I did. The first thing you have to learn about liquid fuel rocket motors is if they don't light right away, get away from them. Turbonique motors are designed with a drain in the bottom of the combustion chamber. There is a spring with a ball and seat. When there is pressure in the combustion chamber, the pressure pushes the ball down on its seat and no pressure is wasted. But if the motor doesn't light, there is no pressure and the excess fuel will slowly drain. Keep in mind, this whole time the spark plugs are buzzing away in an oxygen-rich atmosphere trying to ignite something. My guess was, when Chuck hit the gas, fuel entered the combustion chamber, lots of fuel, but didn't light. Same for the second time, but by now the combustion chambers were probably half full of fuel. The third time, the fuel started to light, but there wasn't enough room in the combustion chamber for clean ignition. But in a moment, the cart thrust motors started to make thrust and were pushing out excess fuel and started burning cleanly. It must have been quite a jolt or a ride when the rocket nozzles cleared the liquid fuel and immediately developed thrust. Oh yeah, normal propyl nitrate, the fuel, doesn't need air to burn, so all the liquid fuel pushed out of the combustion chambers onto the street, soaked into the street and continued to burn, pretty much ruined the street. And after that, Chuck wanted no more part of Turbonique engines, and he said I wouldn't either when I felt how hard they launch. Pretty much like sitting next to sticks of dynamite that go off and blow you down the street. Chuck was not the kind to be scared off by powerful vehicles, so there must have been something spooky about this Turbonique incident. No matter, I didn't expect I wouldn't have technical challenges, and the story Chuck told wasn't much different from other Turbonique horror stories I'd heard. There was no question in my mind that people who were buying them, like Chuck's neighbor, didn't have the knowledge it took to operate liquid fuel rockets. This momentary failure to fire thing was a real problem I knew needed attention. One thing I was sure about, the Turbonique stuff wasn't something amateurs should be fooling with. Yes, they were comparatively small, meaning compared to missiles designed to carry a warhead or take an airplane down, but that didn't mean there was no danger. Frankly, I was a little surprised at the NHRA banning rockets or Turbonique motors. Let's face it, there is real danger in most forms of motorsport. I've always considered solving these problems our job. That's why we do what we do. If we are to have value, we must take on these technical problems and solve them. Let's see, how can I make this clearer? We all know that the first auto race ever held in America was held right here in Chicago, Thanksgiving Day, 1895, and that race kicked off the auto industry in America as the winning car, the Duryea, became America's first production automobile 1 year later. Converting the winning race car to a production car available to the general public requires a ton of work. Race car drivers are, at some level, daredevils. The general public, not so much. Still, early automobiles were anything but safe. It was folks like us that turned this fascinating mechanical device into a useful tool. In the early days, cars didn't have front-wheel brakes. In fact, it was thought by many that front-wheel brakes would be dangerous. Yet, today, the front brakes on cars do 90% of the braking work. Solving these seemingly dangerous problems can yield real progress, but doing so is not for the faint of heart. I could use the Wright brothers' early experiments with developing the airplane as another example. Who, watching their early crashes, would have ever predicted eventually hundreds of thousands of people would travel all over the world on a daily basis via airplane? No, I don't like banning as a way of solving technical problems. That doesn't solve the technical problems, and we cheat ourselves out of advancing technology. So, what happened to Turbonique? Of course, I'm going to tell you, at least my opinion. I'm not sure anyone knows exactly what happened. Between the government's difficult-to-understand hostility toward Gene Middlebrooks, along with Gene's failure to understand human nature and the motorsport marketplace, there were a number of elements involved in the ultimate failure of Turbonique. But figuring out what happened to Turbonique is not the reason I'm telling this story. The reason will come at the end of the story, or as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, if you're old enough to remember Paul Harvey. One thing is sure. Gene Middlebrooks was a brilliant engineer, and Turbonique was an ingenious effort to revolutionize drag racing. While I can't tell you what element played the largest role in the demise of Turbonique, I can tell you how I come to know what I know of the story, including how good the Turbonique motors were. I've already explained my first contact with Turbonique when I witnessed the lightning bug make a pass at Oswego Drag Raceway in 1969, and I was so impressed I subsequently purchased a 1,000 horsepower shaft output Turbonique motor from Turbonique. Unfortunately, during the negotiation process, I discovered motorcycle flat track racing and loved it. Sadly, flat track racing is a young man's sport, and I wanted my shot before it was too late. I put the Turbonique project on hold and gave flat track racing my full attention. I certainly didn't know the Turbonique company would soon be gone. Unfortunately, nature only gave me about 5 years of flat track motorcycle racing, and I was becoming acutely aware it was over. Age is a battle none of us can win. While pondering this dilemma, I received a call from someone who wanted to buy my Turbonique motor. As it turned out, it was Wayne Knuth, the man who I came to learn was the brains behind the Lightning Bug, the VW I saw in 1969 that performed like a top fuel rail. I wasn't really interested in selling the motor, but they wanted to see if I had the right one and maybe talk further. Turbonique made a couple of versions of this style motor, including an 850 horsepower unit. They wanted to see if I had the latest 1,000 horsepower version. They came to my house to see what I had and, I suppose, to talk me out of it. These guys couldn't understand why I still wanted to hold on to the motor when I'd had it for years and hadn't used it. I learned these guys had somehow gotten a hold of the Turbonique sales list and were going around the country buying up 1,000 horsepower motors that were not being used. Apparently I was on the list. As it turned out, I had the right motor and they wanted to buy it. That really wasn't possible. I had plans for it. But I did want to spend some time talking to Wayne. I found him to be a very bright guy who understood the Turbonique motor as well as Gene Middlebrooks. It seems to me he had another guy with him, perhaps his driver. But Wayne was the technical guy who was talking in earnest about buying my engine. It seems after the Lightning Bug, they built a very slick dragster designed to use all of the size and weight assets the Turbonique engines offer. It was called Odyssey, and as near as I can remember, made at least one run of 228 miles an hour at 6-something seconds. Doesn't sound like much today, 2020, but 50 years ago, it was a competitive top fuel match racer. The problem they were having was top fuel cars were getting faster and faster, and to keep up, they were cranking up the fuel pressure. A little knowledge like that would become useful later. Turbonique motors are designed to run at 300 pounds of fuel pressure. The problem was cranking up the fuel pressure was causing them to lose reliability. In fact, they were starting to melt turbine wheels. By this time, Turbonique was no longer in existence. Worse, Gene Middlebrooks, in order to get out of jail, had to agree to never again have anything to do with rocket motors, including building them, repairing them, or offering advice. The government apparently scared him good. I actually got him on the phone some years later, and as soon as he knew the call was about Turbonique, he hung up. The major problem was replacing the turbine wheels. At the time, the only way to make them was via the investment casting process, and that meant one has to start with a perfect master to create a wax master. It's called the lost wax casting process. The Odyssey dragster was toasting turbine wheels, and there were no replacements. As I said before, somehow Wayne got hold of the original sales list and had been going around the country buying up motors from people who purchased them. Of course, this was a limited parts source, and they ended up over time with a number of motors with damaged turbine wheels and fewer replacement possibilities. That's why they were at my house. There was another problem too. They really needed to make the Odyssey faster because of the rapidly increasing performance of the top fuel dragsters. The rear tires on the top fuel cars had reached 16 inches wide, while the Odyssey was designed for 12-inch tires, the standard top fuel tire at the time Odyssey was built. To combat this, Wayne had acquired two of the largest thrust motors Turbonique ever built, over 3,000 horsepower each. The idea was to add them to Odyssey to augment the power. There was a problem here too. Fuel was getting increasingly hard to get. As we chatted, I got the idea they were thinking of building a jet dragster. A jet is completely different from Turbonique. They even had a potential deal in the works with the Arfins brothers from Ohio to buy 2.5 jet engines from them. It seemed to me we might be able to make a deal. They really didn't have the money to buy the jet engines and wanted to know if I'd be interested in buying their Turbonique stuff. It was pretty clear they were at the end of the line with Turbonique. So it started out, they wanted to buy my new 1,000 horsepower shaft output motor, and we ended up making a deal with me buying all of their Turbonique stuff, including Odyssey. Of course, I didn't need any damaged 1,000 horsepower motors, but what I really wanted was the two thrust motors. It seemed clear to me the best deal that I could make would be if I bought all of their stuff, damaged stuff, good stuff, everything. I was still sold on the idea of the Turbonique motor, and if I wanted to, I could bolt my new 1,000 horsepower motor into Odyssey and get it back on the track. Not really my intention, but it's nice to have options. Eventually, we made a deal, and Wayne Knuth and his crew went on to build and campaign a competitive jet dragster called, Odyssey. Of course, life doesn't always go as we hope. When all this was going on, my first wife, Sharon, was suffering from multiple sclerosis. We were young and had no idea what that would mean eventually, but I knew some of the projects I had in mind would take more time than I anticipated. The reason I wanted the two thrust motors was I knew it would be far easier to build a thrust-powered drag bike than a wheel-driven machine. A motor that produces 1,050 foot-pounds of torque at 0 RPM needed a serious drivetrain to hold up under that kind of punishment. This was particularly important with a Turbonique motor because the one thing you positively, absolutely must do is keep the motor under load. If, for example, the drivetrain should break, the unloaded turbine wheel would almost immediately overspeed and explode. Yes, the Turbonique engine has an RPM limiter designed to prevent overspeed by cutting off the fuel flow, but the reality is it's way too slow to catch a turbine wheel overspeeding because of a driveline failure. Inertia alone would propel the wheel to explosive RPM within nanoseconds. The Turbonique overspeed control might help if the problem was the rear wheel or wheels were losing traction, but the motor is still under load. But a driveline failure suddenly unloading the turbine would be a disaster. Even though I hadn't made a lot of progress with the wheel-driven machine, I was well aware of this problem and working on a drive system that wouldn't fail. When Wayne and his guys approached me with the deal, my eyes lit up to get the two thrust motors so I could complete a drag bike more quickly. A thrust machine doesn't need a driveline. Actually, by this time, I'd already arranged with Morris Hyvo Chain Company to build a drive chain for me that could stand up to a 1,000 horsepower hit and survive. They did, in fact, build it for me, but it was 6 inches wide and very heavy. I was concerned about the handling of the finished machine with such a heavy driveline hanging off of one side. I needed to spend more time developing the all-important driveline. A thrust-driven machine wouldn't have any of those problems, so that's what I had in mind. The wheel-driven 1,000 horsepower Turbonique drag bike was still my primary objective, but the idea of an easier-to-build Turbonique machine that I could get on the track more quickly appealed to me. Plus, all Turbonique motors worked the same, and I felt I'd be able to learn more about Turbonique motors and the monopropellant fuel, normal propyl nitrate, or thermaline as they called it, without having to worry about driveline failure and the overspeeding the turbine wheel problem I'd have to deal with a wheel-driven machine. Ultimately, I knew I needed to beat top fuel dragsters with a wheel-driven machine because I did understand human nature, and many wouldn't accept a motorcycle beating top fuel cars if it wasn't wheel-driven, as they were. So, now I had the Odyssey dragster, perhaps a half dozen 1,000 horsepower motors with damaged turbine wheels, one 850 horsepower Turbonique motor in good shape, and a pile of spare parts. Oh, even a dragster trailer and, oh yes, a half a drum of fuel. Of course, I also had the two all-important to me thrust motors. I was ready. Ready for what? In case you haven't gotten it, I really felt in order to bring attention to the financial plight of the motorsport community because of their omission from television, I needed a way to bring attention to the issue. I needed something truly spectacular, something television couldn't possibly ignore, some reason for network television to swing their cameras in my direction so I could call the public's attention to the fact that success in the sports entertainment marketplace was totally dependent on television attention to our sport. It seemed to me a spectacular drag bike beating top fuel dragsters might just do it. I mean, I lived in a huge media market, Chicago, and a local guy revolutionizing drag racing might just do it. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea wasn't really important because it was the only idea I had to bring public attention to an important cultural problem I knew must be solved if we were to survive in some form. I suppose being Elvis or Michael Jackson or Robert Redford might have been a better idea for attracting attention. But I am none of those people. I'm a racer and have been a racer my entire life. If I was going to do anything spectacular, it would have to be something involving motorsport. That's what I am. I make no apologies for it. I am proud of the motorsport community and proud to be part of it. Of course, I was aware it might be true that television, via omitting us for 70 years, may have poisoned the water of public consciousness so completely, nothing we could do would attract their attention. If that were the case, whatever I could do would fail. The only way to find out was to give it my best shot. With the acquisition of significantly more Turbonique stuff, including the two incredibly powerful thrust motors, I felt I was closer to bringing a ray of sunshine into the motorsport community than ever before. I knew the thrust motor drag bike would not be accepted by most drag racing fans, but I might be forgiven if I had a wheel-driven machine in the works to follow. I was sure the general public would accept a thrust-driven drag bike, and the general public was my immediate concern. Somehow, it seemed to me the thrust motor machine would be quick and easy to build. I really needed this because my wife's illness was getting worse, and I could only guess at how much time and resources I'd be able to devote to these projects. You know, it's funny. When you are young and don't have to deal with multiple sclerosis and a wide variety of life's trapdoors, how easily you think you can vault life's challenges. The energy and capability of youth is unbridled. Too bad you don't keep this as you get older. When Sharon was first diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I didn't know what it was. There was no internet back then. I had to go to the library. I looked up muscular dystrophy. I had much to learn. Anyway, with the acquisition of the two thrust motors totaling 6,640 horsepower and using a gallon of fuel per second, and me with only the knowledge of having seen the lightning bug make a pass at Oswego Dragway years earlier in 1969, and perhaps a dozen conversations with the creator of Turbonique, Gene Middlebrooks, what to do next? I figured the first thing I needed to do was build a test stand to test these two motors and learn how to use the stuff I got from Wayne Knuth that supported the operation of Turbonique engines. Oh sure, Odyssey used the 1,000 horsepower Turbonique shaft output motor, and I suppose it wouldn't need exactly the same paraphernalia as the two thrust motors, but it would be similar. And I had one more thing. Absolute confidence in my ability to make this stuff work. I should also mention Wayne Knuth was helpful. As I said, he knew these motors as well as Gene Middlebrooks. Sort of surprising because he was just a customer of Turbonique and most customers didn't have a guess about how they operated. Part of Turbonique's problem. Wayne did. He was a very sharp guy. Somehow, I completely understood it almost by just looking at it. I'm not alone. Many in the motorsport community have this unique ability to look at mechanical devices and completely understand them without much, if any, training. I've always thought it was a little like those with musical ability who can pick up a guitar without ever having played a guitar and in a few minutes make music. I envy this gift, and I can't do it. But this stuff I understood. Okay, a test stand. I didn't know how loud these things would be, so I thought the test stand should be mobile. I decided to build the stand in the back of a van that I had. It didn't seem that complicated to me. These were thrust motors, so all I had to do was come up with a way to fire them up and measure how much of a push they provided. Easy enough. I'll just build a sort of parallelogram with the bottom portion securely bolted to the floor of the van and the top part with the motor securely bolted to it, attached to the bottom part with links that would allow a little bit of fore and aft movement. Of course, I really didn't want it to move, but it had to be free to move, so I could have the upper part of the test stand pushing against a stop block. Something like you see at the end of railroad tracks, so rail cars could bump into them and stop. Of course, it would be much smaller. I wasn't trying to stop a railroad car. Then, between the upper part of the parallelogram with the motors bolted to it and the stop block, I positioned a hydraulic load cell to measure the force being exerted. I think those things are all pretty visible in the pictures. I hope so. This is public access television and I don't have an animator. I know this would make it easier to visualize, but I don't know how to do it and it's just me here. As I was working on the test stand, it occurred to me I needed a way to read the instruments providing the information for which I was testing. Okay, beginning with a line running from the hydraulic load cell to a gauge. But where to put the gauge? It had to be someplace where I could read it, but isolated for safety reasons. I still didn't know what I was up against when firing these motors. I finally decided to take advantage of the fact the van was a window van, so I built a rack just inside the big side window and placed the gauges there. I had it in the back of my mind to put an 8mm movie camera on a tripod and film the gauges from the outside of the van as I initiated test firings. Yes, an 8mm movie camera. This was long before videotape. In fact, this was long before I had any interest in television, so it was my father's 8mm movie camera. I know anyone paying attention to the story is probably thinking I have some sort of death wish. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm actually a very careful person who just believes there are technical solutions to technical problems if one applies himself. There was no question in my mind that Turbonique motors worked. Remember, I saw the lightning bug run in person, and I don't forget things like that. There were technical problems to be solved, not technical problems with creating power. I knew Turbonique motors did that. But there were technical problems with converting that power to useful energy. Perhaps it would be understandable if I explained it like this. Imagine a stick of dynamite being ignited. I don't think anyone would doubt that that energy was going to be released. The problem to solve is, how do we capture and use that release of energy? That's the technical challenge. We know there is release of energy. In other words, the stick of dynamite works. Similarly, we know Turbonique works. The question is, how do we use what it produces? Engineering problems I'm sure we can solve if we understand them and create solutions. That's what we're here for, the motorsport community. Of course, we have to be colorful and entertaining, but at our core, we're here to solve technical problems. I think top fuel drag cars are a perfect example of what I mean. Back in my teenage days, top fuel cars were just starting to break into the 200-mile-an-hour bracket. When I was in high school in 1960, Chris Carmazzini's The Golden Greek went 204 miles an hour in Alton, Illinois, the first to break the 200-mile-an-hour barrier. But of course, they wanted more. But how to do it? They had plenty of power and were already spinning the huge slicks for the entire quarter mile. How can we go faster? The key was solving the problem of having a crankshaft turning at 7,000 RPM and the rear wheels not turning at all, as in at the starting line. In order to go, one has to engage a crankshaft that has to be turning 7,000 RPM to make any real power, with the rear wheels not turning at all. Connecting one to the other is a real problem. At the time, it was solved by slipping the tires. The crankshaft was still turning 7,000 RPM, and now the tires were spinning at a corresponding RPM. There had to be slippage somewhere. The answer then was smoke the tires. Over time, we learned it was better to not spin the tires to maintain maximum traction. But how? The answer at the time was the slipper clutch. Of course, there were other things tried, like two-speed transmissions, but the slipper clutch seemed to hold the most promise. The engine crankshaft was still spinning at 7,000 RPM and the rear wheels were not spinning, but the slipper clutch between the two was slipping and absorbing excess energy until about 3/4 of the way down the track. It sounds easy now, but it took 20 years to develop the technology to where it is today. But this is what we do. Here's a thought. How about if we had an engine that made all of its power at 0 RPM? You know, one could connect the engine directly to the rear wheels, not spin the tires, and accelerate for the entire quarter mile without wasting anything, no slipping. Sound pretty good? Now you may understand those who were enthusiastic about Gene Middlebrook's Turbonique engine. That's what it could do. But it needed development, a way of using what it could do. I still think it just needs development and has a much greater potential for drag racing purposes than the internal combustion engine. I think Gene Middlebrooks was right. Okay, back to the test stand. As I began working on it, I realized I was going to need far more information than how much of a push they were developing. Of course, the push or thrust was important and ultimately what we were trying to accomplish, but how we got there is important too, perhaps even more important during development. I gave it some thought. Starting from the beginning, I knew I needed a gauge to indicate the all-important fuel pressure, and then I thought it would be nice to know oxygen pressure, even though the motor doesn't need it to run. On the other hand, these motors start and run on a permission system. Fuel doesn't flow until there is oxygen downstream of the oxygen solenoid. If I pushed the button and nothing happened, I'd need to know if oxygen made its way into the combustion chambers, and if it did, it should have given permission for the fuel to flow. And if the fuel wasn't flowing, actually, when I was working on this test stand and thinking about this possible momentary failure to fire problem associated with liquid fuel rocket engines, it seemed to me it would be wise to include a start fuel system. Let me see if I can explain this. If the concern is the very first droplets of atomized fuel entering the combustion chamber must ignite, then it seemed to me making it easy to ignite was important. So, given that each of the two thrust motors had 4 fuel injectors, it seemed like a good idea to take one fuel injector in each motor and separate it from the system. This means it has its own smaller solenoid and smaller fuel system. The idea being the oxygen solenoid would give permission only to the start fuel solenoid opening, and it sprayed a small amount of fuel into the combustion chambers. Then there is a combustion chamber pressure sensor that controlled the main solenoid, so if both combustion chamber sensors indicated pressure in both combustion chambers, it sent a signal, permission, opening the main fuel solenoid. The idea being to make sure there was a good fire going in both combustion chambers before the massive amount of fuel provided by the 3 remaining fuel injectors in each motor sprayed into the combustion chambers. It's been more than 40 years since I worked on this stuff, so I don't really remember if this is the way these motors were supposed to operate or if this was something Wayne Knuth came up with to address this momentary failure to fire problem, but it made sense to me. Oh yes, I added one more thing to address this problem. When I acquired all the spare parts from Wayne Knuth and the Odyssey team, I had plenty of Ford tractor coils in the pile of spares. These were the ignition systems Turbonique used to light the fire in the combustion chambers. The Turbonique thrust motors each had 1 spark plug and 1 tractor coil, as seen in this picture of a car into which someone installed the big thrust motors. Notice each motor has only 1 spark plug. It seemed to me, thinking about this momentary failure to fire danger, the motors could use all the spark plugs they could get. I bolted each motor onto my milling machine table and drilled and tapped an extra spark plug hole in each motor. To me, it seemed obvious, but maybe only because I had the extra tractor coils to power the extra spark plugs. So, in the event you're not following, let's review. After turning on the ignition system that has 2 spark plugs buzzing in each combustion chamber, yes, one can hear them, then I push the go button. All it does is open the oxygen solenoid to flood the combustion chambers with pure oxygen. There is a permission switch in each combustion chamber, and when they are both satisfied, each combustion chamber is oxygen rich, they allow the start fuel system to spray a small amount of fuel into both combustion chambers. To be clear, this means you have 2 combustion chambers filled with oxygen, and each chamber has 2 spark plugs buzzing away when a small amount of fuel is sprayed into each combustion chamber from 1 fuel injector in each motor. If all goes well, the fuel ignites, creating at least 50 pounds of combustion chamber pressure. Not enough to go anywhere, but enough to trigger the main fuel system, providing there is at least 50 pounds of pressure in both chambers. Meaning, you have a good fire going in both chambers before providing permission to the main fuel system, which then sprays fuel into the combustion chamber of both motors at 300 pounds of fuel pressure. The result is something akin to fire hoses trying to drench a fire, but with fuel instead of water. It seemed to me I needed to observe all of these thresholds of Turbonique engine operation as they occurred. When I was putting the mobile test stand together, I had it in my mind that I would be able to watch the gauges and see that each permission step would be observable, meaning when I pushed the button, I would be able to see the oxygen downstream gauge pop to 175 pounds, then watch the start fuel gauge pop to 300 downstream pounds, etc. From the very first test, I could see this wouldn't be possible. I know it sounds like it takes a long time after pushing the button for the various permission steps to take place. The reality is, when you push the button, it goes boom. Right now. There is no noticeable time elapsed. It surprised me. I'd been working on this so long on paper, it just seemed normal it would take time to go through the steps. And I suppose it does. I mean, it has to. There's no other way. It's just that the time involved isn't noticeable in human terms. I'm sure the blink of an eye takes some time, but it sure wouldn't be time we would notice. Measurable in a laboratory? Sure. But not by looking at your watch. Plus the fact, by the time I had all the necessary gauges mounted, there were 27 of them. Way too much information to know when everything happened so fast. The 8mm movie film became a more important feature of my plan, except I wouldn't know until the film was processed. This was the old days when you had to have film processed at the laboratory before you could see it. The quality was too poor to be of much value, even when viewing one frame at a time. 8mm film is just not laboratory quality. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, though, because when I first started testing, I did it behind my home in front of my garage. I wanted all my stuff handy in case I needed last-minute adjustments. The first test was just one fuel injector, the start fuel system. It didn't occur to me it would be unacceptably loud. You have to remember, I bought my house when I was 21 years old. I've been there a long time, and people are sort of used to me. I mean, I have an engine dyno in my basement, and despite the fact that I took great care to sound insulate the surrounding area, I still get occasional dirty looks. I make sure I keep the dyno time to a minimum. It's a small engine dyno anyway, mostly snowmobile and motorcycle engines. And you thought I didn't have good judgment. I must admit, in addition to being surprised by how fast the boom occurred after I pushed the remote button, yes, I had a remote button. I told you I had good judgment. Anyway, in addition to being surprised by this, I was also surprised by the sound. I mean, it was only one fuel injector, and combustion chamber pressure only made it to about 60 pounds. I didn't think it was that bad. But it did attract some neighbors and a police car. I quickly explained nothing really happened. I was just testing a motor. No harm, no foul. There was a little grumbling, but everybody, including the police, seemed to leave happy. Well, sort of happy. I don't think they really understood what I was doing. You know, testing a couple of liquid fuel rocket engines. But they left, and I wasn't arrested. A couple of weeks later, I was ready to test the motors again, this time with a second fuel injector in each engine. In other words, this time I would be able to test all of the steps in the engine permission system. No, it wouldn't be full power. That would occur only with all 4 fuel injectors in each motor operating. This would only be the start fuel system triggering the next fuel injector. It was the next logical step. Everything worked as planned in the test of the start fuel system. Now I had to see if the main fuel system would kick in properly. Granted, it was only 1 injector per motor in the main fuel system instead of 3, but it would tell the tale of the operational quality of the engine permission system. After setting everything up, I decided it might be a good idea to let the police know they were probably going to get some calls about the noise. I called and told them I was going to test an engine. If anyone called, to just ignore it, and I would call them back as soon as I was finished, a matter of a few minutes. They told me they couldn't just ignore calls. They had to respond. Okay, I told them, just don't run over anyone on the way. Nothing to worry about, and I'll let you know. This time, I pushed the button, and the boom was significant. I think I only had a gallon of fuel in it, but it still lasted a few seconds. I could see the blast blew my neighbor's garbage cans halfway into his yard, and I thought looking at those rocket nozzles with smoke wafting out of them, very cool, like a couple of cannons smoking. Then the hordes started arriving. People from blocks away came to see what was going on, and they were mad as hell. I quickly went into the garage to call the police and tell them everything was okay, and they were plenty mad too. By the time I hung up, no cell phones back then, and walked back outside, quite a growing angry crowd had gathered. I sort of felt like the Frankenstein guy's castle being surrounded by angry villagers with torches. I looked around and thought, the only thing missing is the torches. Of course, now the police cars started arriving. Everyone was mad. The general feeling seemed to be everyone thought a house had exploded. You know, a gas explosion. They were plenty mad, and despite my reassurances about just testing a motor, they were not settling down. And now I was getting a little mad. I told one particularly angry man who was yelling that I didn't have any children and I worked nights, and I had to be disturbed by his screaming kids every day. We all have to be tolerant of each other. It was getting pretty heated, but one particularly angry woman did get through to me. She'd been screaming repeatedly from somewhere in the crowd, "There's a crazy man in the neighborhood." And I knew she meant me. Then she said something I haven't thought about. She said I was going to give some poor old person a heart attack. I'd just lost my dad to a heart attack 6 months earlier, and that bothered me. I must admit, I didn't think of that. As it turned out, the police presence turned out to be a good thing. They settled everybody down and dispersed the crowd. They didn't say much to me, but just wanted to see if everything was all right. I guess they had to make sure a house hadn't exploded. I explained what I was doing, sort of, and said I wouldn't do it again. Little by little, they departed. I must admit, I didn't think our little suburb had that many police cars. I mean, they lined the alley in both directions and went out into the street. The woman's comment about giving some elderly person a heart attack bothered me. I hadn't thought of that. I guess young people are never sensitive to the needs of the elderly, and her comment, screamed out in the midst of calling me a crazy man, probably wouldn't have struck home if I hadn't just lost my father. I told myself I have to be more careful, and testing in my backyard was probably over. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. I really am trying to be brief, but we're talking about 40 years of my life, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised at how long the story is taking. But I really am surprised. Perhaps it's because I'm remembering more than I thought I would. Anyway, with the few minutes I have left, I just want to take a moment to thank John Platania and Pete Bellender for helping me in the studio taping these segments. We'll pick up on the Turbonique story in the next episode of Motorsports Unlimited, Explanation 19, including full power tests on my mobile test stand and much more. Just remember, from my perspective, and the perspective of some very sharp guys, there was nothing wrong with the Turbonique motors. Gene Middlebrooks was busted for mail fraud, not lack of power. I'll explain and continue the story as I know it next week, and we'll talk about all of it, including the reason I'm telling you the story, or as Paul Harvey probably would have said, the rest of the story. I don't think it works without his deep voice.
This program made possible in part by support from ABC Auto Parts, located on Ashland Avenue at 138th Street in Blue Island, Illinois.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Jimmy's Red Hots, located on Grant Avenue and Pulaski Road in Chicago.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think. Now, this is not one of our usual next weeks promoting next week's program. This is a reminder that Motorsports Unlimited is now global on YouTube. Simply subscribe to Bill Wildt Motorsports Unlimited on YouTube and watch us anytime.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.